Chapter 2. The day of the crossing began before dawn. It began with a rude, angry jostling of men made weak by the unaccustomed weight of urgency and equipment, with a laggard company formation on the dark road, and a sullen, cursing forward march. The sky and the land were turning blue by the time the column reached the bridge. The crossing itself was a matter of trying to keep from slipping down a hill of loose dirt that led to the waterline, then of treading carefully and for what seemed a great distance on the steel cleats of a footpath whose shuddering pontoons rolled low in the loud black and silver flood of the river, and then of climbing another hill of dirt on the opposite shore. Soon everything was green and gold. They were walking on a neat macadam road through woodland, and the only sound except for their rubber-heeled boots was the song of birds high in the trees. Lieutenant Coverley, in what appeared to be a burst of nervous energy, was making his way down the platoon to have encouraging little talks with his men. Prentice saw him up ahead, chatting with Finn. Then he dropped back to spend some time with Mueller, walking with his hand on Mueller's shoulder, and then he exchanged a few words with Walker, who said something that made him laugh. "And how are you doing, Prentice?" he said, still smiling from Walker's joke. "Okay, sir. I imagine this is quite a change for you after the hospital. Well, keep it up." They marched all morning, with 5-minute breaks every hour. At noon they stopped in a clearing beside the road, a clearing that contained 2 dead German soldiers, to eat their K rations. Most of the men stayed as far away as possible from the corpses, but Krupka seemed to enjoy them. He kicked them in the ribs and stood on them. Then, finding a pair of black-rimmed eyeglasses in the grass near one of them, he fitted them back onto the dead man's face as carefully as a little girl playing with a doll. "Hey, you guys," he called. "I bet you none of you's got guts enough to sit on one of these bastards and eat. $5. I got $5, says none of you's got guts enough." Nobody took him on, so he did it himself. He sat on the chest of the bespectacled corpse and spooned up his can of dehydrated eggs, which were almost exactly the color of the dead man's flesh. Then they marched all afternoon. They passed occasional barns and farmhouses, all of which appeared to be abandoned. But for the most part there was nothing in sight but trees and fields and endlessly unwinding road. Once Prentice looked up to find the jaunty, handsome figure of Paul Underwood walking beside him. "Here, Prentice," he said, "present for you." And he gave Prentice a hand grenade from which the pin had been removed. "Jesus!" Prentice held it in one tight, trembling hand while Underwood laughed. "What's the matter?" "Hell, it's safe as long as you hold the spoon down." And Prentice realized now that Underwood, for all his apparent carelessness, had pressed it into his hand in such a way that it couldn't have dropped. "Well, but I mean, where is the pin?" "Nobody knows, that's the funny part. Guys have been passing it up and down the column all day. Here, I'll take it back. Careful now." And Underwood moved gracefully away up the column to find another victim for his practical joke. A little later, Prentice saw him leave the road and go trotting out into a field. When he was about 100 yards away, he stopped and crouched, and Prentice figured out what he was doing. He was burying the grenade, packing earth or rocks around it, and this struck Prentice as an appallingly rash thing to do. What if some farmer, or for God's sake, some child, should come and stumble over it? But then what else was Underwood to do with the thing? He certainly couldn't keep it, and he probably couldn't throw it because the enemy might be close enough to hear the explosion. In any case, it wasn't something Prentice could afford to think about. All his mind was occupied with walking, making his swollen feet rise painfully and rise and fall, and matching his breath to their rhythm. He had a pain in his chest, but couldn't tell if it was the bad lung or the weight of the bag of 6 rifle grenades that rode over it. Where the hell did Underwood get the strength to run out there and back? By dusk, which brought a chilly wind, a number of men were falling behind. The column was bedraggled on both sides of the road, and Prentice kept passing dim shapes of men sitting on the ground or lying down. The men directly ahead of him, Walker, was showing signs of weakness, sometimes drifting back to within a boot or two of Prentice before he pulled himself forward again. But Mueller was more to carry than anyone else, was doing well. The steady motion of his plump, baby-shaped back had begun to serve Prentice as a goad. Once Mueller stumbled and fell, but clumsily righted himself, using his bar, barrel down as a crutch to help him back on his feet. The muzzle was probably plugged with dirt after that, but that didn't spoil his performance in Prentice's eyes. If he can make it, Prentice told himself, I'll make it too. They spent the night in a barn with guards posted around its yard. Most of the second platoon was assigned to the loft. They had to climb a wooden ladder to get there and used cupped matches to find their way around in the darkness. But once they were settled, they found it very comfortable to stretch out under their raincoats for sleep. It could have been minutes or hours later when they were jolted awake by a shriek slam. It might not have been a direct hit on the roof, but it sure as hell sounded like one. And so did the 3 explosions that came rapidly after it. By the time of the second shell, the barn loft was a madhouse of shouting, stumbling, colliding men, all heading for the ladder and struggling to climb down. Let me out of here. Get out of the fucking way. Prentice felt a squirm of fingers under his boot on one of the rungs and heard a scream. Then another boot crushed his own fingers, and someone's swinging rifle butt cracked him across the head. He lost his footing halfway down the ladder and fell, scrabbling, hitting the concrete floor and rolled, and another man fell heavily into his arms. Easy, Sergeant Loomis was calling. Take it easy, for Christ's sake. Then it was over, and there were no more shells. But nobody wanted to go back to the loft, and the ground floor of the barn was impossibly crowded. A standing man could hardly move without stepping on someone's wrist or ankle, and there were many curses and yelps of pain. But at last, somehow, room was found for everyone to lie down, and a kind of peace descended once again. When Prentice's turn for guard duty came, sometime after midnight, he stepped on 3 men and making his way outside the barn. And when it was over, after 2 hours of peering into the darkness with the wind in his face and his head ringing from the bruise of the rifle butt, he knew he couldn't find his former sleeping place. Instead, he felt his way along one wall, then went down on his knees to feel along the floor. His hands sank into a heap of straw or silage, and he lay down in it with a sense of unexpected luxury. Someone else's warm, broad back lay close beside him, and he nestled gratefully up to it. Only when daylight came did he discover that he'd been sleeping in a straw-covered mound of pig manure, and that the back he had pressed against was that of a sleeping pig. Where the hell are we going? The men kept asking each other on the second morning's march. What the hell's the deal? But by noon, everyone knew what the deal was. 3 small towns lay ahead of them within a space of several miles. If they found no enemy resistance in the first town, they would go on to the second, and if that town too was evacuated, they would take the third. Be one damn long walk, that's all, somebody said, and they'll be laying back there lobbing 88s at us all the way. Soon they left the road to move out across open fields, and the column was reformed into a wide, intricate attack formation. Each squad was formed with the 2 scouts going first, then the barman with riflemen on either side of him, then the squad leader flanked by other riflemen with the assistant squad leader bringing up the rear. That was the way they approached the first town, moving up over the slope of a newly plowed field, with the second platoon leading the company and Finn's squad leading the platoon. Spread it out now, Finn kept calling. Don't bunch up now. Spread it out. Moving stealthily along on Mueller's right flank, his rifle at port arms and his finger on the safety, Prentice felt his face twitching in an uncontrollable little tick. The distant line of houses ahead might well be filled with German machine gunners, crouched and waiting for all these small green and brown figures to come a little closer across the field. They'd be taking aim now, telling each other to hold their fire, and Prentice himself would be one of their 3 or 4 primary targets. But nothing happened. As they came closer, they could see that nearly all the houses had white flags hanging from their windows. And then they saw a cluster of black-clad civilian men coming out into the field with a white flag held high. 2 of the civilians broke into a stumbling run to meet the soldiers, calling and gesturing. One of them wore a chain of office over his dusty frock coat. He seemed to be the mayor of the town. And so there was nothing to do but move on into the streets, which were littered with cast-off German army equipment, packs, helmets, even rifles, and to make token checks of houses here and there to look for enemy troops. Civilians clustered around them as they entered each house. One old man clutched Prentice by the sleeve and showed him a grubby document, pointing to each printed line of it with a trembling forefinger. It seemed to be legal proof that he was a citizen of some country other than Germany. "Some of these bastards are Jerry soldiers in civilian clothes," Sergeant Loomis said. "They probably changed them 10 minutes ago." A brief artillery barrage came in as they made their way through the town, and Prentice found himself sitting wedged between Mueller and a weeping old woman on the floor of a cellar. But soon the sky was quiet again. Then it was time to move on to the second town, and the second town was so much like the first that the two became blurred in memory. By the time it was cleared, heavy fatigue had settled over the men. It was only 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but Prentice wanted nothing more than a chance to sleep. He didn't even want to eat until he'd slept. Yet to think about food was to realize he had never been so hungry in his life. "The third town will be the bitch," someone was saying. "That's where they'll be holed up and waiting for us." And the third town was another 3 miles away. "Spread it out," Finn kept calling. "Don't bunch up now." "I said spread it out, Prentice." They were approaching the third town, across a long meadow that led up to a wooded ridge. The town was said to be close on the other side of the ridge, and the word that was that B Company, moving in from somewhere on the right, would make the initial assault. Finn's squad had gone less than a third of the way across the meadow when the earth was shaken by a great explosion behind them. And whirling around, Prentice saw a spire of dirt and smoke and clutter rising straight up, more than 50 yards high, from a part of the dirt road they had just crossed. It was a mine. And now, among the spinning, falling fragments, he could make out the shape of a pair of automobile wheels. It was a Jeep. The company runner's Jeep, he heard later, and both Jeep and driver had been blown to bits. Was this the kind of mine that Quint had stepped on? No, probably this was a bigger one. But the 2 mines, that had killed Quint and the medics must have gone off with the same shocking abruptness, filling the air with the same brutal flavor of chance. "Keep it spread out now," Finn was calling. Climbing the ridge was an arduous job. There was a thick, entangling underbrush, and there were twigs to catch at your equipment straps and whip your face. On top of the ridge, they moved cautiously toward the brink of the opposite slope until they could see what lay ahead. A deep, flat field, perhaps 200 yards across, and then another treeless hill leading up to the densely packed houses of the town. A town in which no white flags were hung. The 2 scouts, Drake and Kripke, were crouched in the brush and waiting for Finn, who went forward and began arranging his men in a line across the crest, 5 or 10 yards apart. The second squad was forming a similar line on their left, and the third was in reserve, somewhere behind them in the trees. The platoon command group was over on the right, where the ridge was considerably lower. Looking down in that direction, Prentice could see Loomis's profiled head and another helmet that was probably Coverley's. Just ahead of them, at the base of the ridge where the field began, there was a small industrial brick structure, an electric power station or something. And Paul Underwood was standing in its shelter, turning back to smile and say something to Loomis. "Keep it low now," Finn was saying. "Keep it low in the brush, heads down." Prentice deepened his crouch and ducked his head lower. Then he saw that Walker and Brownlee on either side of him were getting into a prone position, and he lay down too. gratefully letting himself relax against the earth. It meant he could no longer see Finn or Loomis, but he could still see Walker, and Walker could see them. When Walker moved, he would move too, and Brownlee and the others would follow him. In the meantime, he would simply lie here, switching his gaze between Walker and the gray, silent town across the field. But he found that when he looked at the town, the shapes of its houses tended to swim together in a drowsing mist. Lying down was too damned comfortable. It was all he could do to keep his eyes from closing. What the hell were they waiting for? Then he remembered. They were waiting for B Company to go in first, on the right. And no sooner had he remembered this than there came a ringing sputter of machine gun fire from the right-hand side of the town, instantly followed by more machine guns and bars and rifles, until all the sounds were blended in a welter of noise. B Company! And what the hell were they supposed to do now? Were they just supposed to lie here while B Company got torn apart? He rose briefly, just enough to see that Finn was still huddled behind a bush, and that down beyond him Loomis's and Coverley's helmets had made no movement. Apparently, no orders had yet been given for A Company to advance across the field. He lay down again and forced himself to watch Walker, who was watching Finn, who in turn was watching Loomis and Coverley. The gunfire dwindled a little, and then was resumed. It was steady for a while, and it dwindled again. The noise of it began to rise and fall almost rhythmically, like the sound of the sea or his own breathing. It formed a cadence for the small chant in his mind. If I watch Walker and Walker watches Finn and Finn watches Loomis. If I watch Walker and Walker watches Finn and Finn watches Loomis. If I watch Loomis and Loomis watch... No, wait. If I watch... Slam! He was awake and on his feet in a split second, and the first thing he saw was that Walker was still there. Walker was getting up and spinning around to see where the shell had fallen. Yellow dust was rising and clods of earth were falling around them. Slam! He saw Walker fall again, get up, run a few steps one way and a few steps another, like a man in panic. And now turning, he saw Brownlee's face rise up over the brush, open-mouthed and wide-eyed. Slam! The branch of a tree came crashing to the ground beside him. Brownlee's head ducked down again, and only now did Prentice see that Finn and Loomis and Coverley were no longer there, nor were they anywhere to be seen in the empty field ahead. Near the little brick structure, the grass had been torn away in a ragged shell hole, and close beside it he saw Ted the medic crouched over someone who was lying down. The noise of small arms fire was so intense that it was impossible to tell how much of it was coming this way. The whole field might be humming with bullets. Slam! A lone man was running out across the field now, holding his free arm high in a gesture of "Follow me." It was Sergeant Bernstein. Suicide. And Prentice followed him. He felt an exultant animal energy as he galloped through the brush and down the hillside, yelling, "Come on!" at the top of his lungs to Walker and Brownlee and anyone else who might still be back there. At the base of the hill, he lost his balance and went sprawling, but he was up and running again with the wind singing in his helmet and the rifle grenade bag pounding his sword chest, convinced that this was the bravest thing he had ever done in his life. Shells were still coming in, but they were falling behind him now. Back on the ridge were Walker and Brownlee, and God only knew how many others were still huddled. Only Bernstein and he himself, it seemed, were crossing the field. He ran so fast that he'd almost caught up with Bernstein in time to climb the hill with him. Bernstein had just reached the crest and fallen into a crouch, turning around when Prentice came panting up behind him. "Where's my squad?" Bernstein demanded. "I don't know. They must be back there. You know where Finn is?" "No." "Well, you better stay with me. Come on." And still crouching, they ran up over the crest into a small, shabby backyard full of rusting automobile parts and piled up boxes that proved to be rabbit warrens. The gunfire could have been coming from across the street or even from this house itself, but Bernstein seemed to know what he was doing. He ran straight for the back door of the house, and without breaking his stride, he raised his rifle butt and brought it down on the knob and lock of the door, shouldering all his weight against it in the same motion, whipping the rifle back up to the ready as he lunged inside. Prentice loped after him into a prim kitchen that smelled of recent cooking. Bernstein was already disappearing down a dark hall, calling, "You take the upstairs." Prentice found the stairway and took it 2 steps at a time with his heart in his mouth, half expecting to find a German machine gunner poised at the top landing or waiting in one of the rooms. He smashed open the first of the bedroom doors and went charging in, badly off balance but with his rifle ready at the hip. There was a neatly made double bed, a flounced dressing table scented with perfume, and a closet that swung open to reveal a mass of men's and women's clothing. Some of the clothes were the uniforms of a German officer, and an officer's high-crowned garrison cap sat on the hat shelf beside several civilian fedoras. There were 2 other bedrooms, both empty, and he had just finished with the last of them when Bernstein's voice called, "Okay up there?" "Okay." And they were out in the backyard again, vaulting over a low latticework fence to approach the next house. Where the hell was the fire coming from? This house was bigger, and they took the ground floor together, then they ran upstairs with Bernstein in the lead. He slammed into the first bedroom while Prentice took the second, and they attacked the third and largest room together. There was a bed in the room with a crude canopy of blankets hanging over it from the length of clotheslines strung high on the walls. Prentice wondered what to do about it. Tear the canopy down? And he was still wondering when Bernstein raised his rifle and fired 3 times into it with an ear-splitting noise, making 3 little black holes in the quivering cloth. And it wasn't until they were halfway downstairs again that Prentice began to worry about what might have lain under the canopy. What if it was an old man or woman, too sick to be evacuated with the rest of the family? Or a couple of children playing Indian inside their homemade tent? But they were approaching their third house now, crouching low as they ran across an alley. The kitchen door was standing open, and inside they found 3 huddled men, Loomis, Coverly, and Klein. "Donkey Dog," Klein was saying into his radio, plugging one ear with his free hand to block out the noise of gunfire. "Donkey Dog, this is Donkey Nan. Donkey Nan, do you read me?" "Bernstein, where the hell are your men?" Loomis said. "I thought they were following me. I guess they're all back on the—" Klein had gotten through to company headquarters now, and Coverly had grabbed the radio, talking in a high, quavering voice that sounded almost on the verge of tears. "I've lost contact with the element on the right," he was saying. "I've lost contact with the element on the left. I don't know what the hell we're doing here, and I don't even know how many men I've got. Most of my men are still pinned down on the ridge." "Pinned down my ass," Loomis said. "They're scared shitless, that's what they are." And then Sergeant Finn appeared from the hallway, followed by Mueller and Gardinella and Sam Rand. They were all out of breath. Apparently, they'd just finished clearing the house. "Finn," Loomis said, "how many men did you bring over? Just these 3? "That's right." "I'm here, Finn," Prentice said. "Well, where the hell have you been?" "I came over with Bernstein. Hell, we've already cleared 2. "How come you didn't follow me?" "I didn't see you go. Bernstein was the only one "All right, shut up, everybody," Loomis said. The lieutenant was still on the radio, wiping his wet face with his free hand. "No, sir, I don't," he was saying. "No, sir, I don't." The sounds of fire were still close in the street outside. What were they supposed to do now? Just wait here until the rest of the men came across? Bernstein showed no sign of eagerness to move out again, nor did Finn. Edging away from them, trying to make himself inconspicuous, Prentice saw that the oven door of the kitchen stove was open. And now he saw what made the sweet vanilla smell he'd been aware of ever since coming into the room. It was an angel food cake, set out to cool, apparently abandoned just before the woman of the house had fled. He touched it with his forefinger, making a little dirty dimple in its top. It was still warm. "Yes," Lieutenant Coverly was saying. All right, sir." Ted the medic came blundering in from outside, winded and very red in the face. "How's Paul, Ted?" someone asked him. "He's gone," Ted said. "Concussion. There wasn't a mark on him." "Jesus," said Bernstein, and Loomis said, "Oh, shit." Prentice was dumbfounded. Did they mean Paul Underwood? Did they mean he was dead? There wasn't a mark on him, Ted said again. Then he came over and sat in a chair beside the angel food cake and started to cry. It was a terrible thing to watch. He was sitting there with tears dribbling down his dirty face and his hands trying to wipe them away, his lips curling and bloating like a baby's. There wasn't a mark on him. There wasn't anything I could do for him. Then Bernstein was leading Prentice out of the house again, following Finn and Rand and Gardinella and Mueller. They were to clear other houses and set up defensive positions until the rest of the platoon came over. Other doors were smashed open. Other empty rooms were disclosed. Was Prentice supposed to go on working with Bernstein now, or should he follow Finn? There was no chance to ask. He was following Bernstein out of another house when Bernstein turned and held him back. "No, wait, Prentice," he said, his scholarly face screwed up in concentration. He was evidently working out primitive tactics in his mind. "You stay here and keep that lot covered. See there?" And he pointed to a window that faced a gray vacant lot, irregularly bordered by other houses. "You stay here. You see anybody run across that lot, use your rifle. Got that?" He nodded yes and hurried over to kneel by the window. "Okay," Bernstein said. "Stay on the ball now, whatever happens." And he went jogging out of the house, calling something to someone else. Prentice did as he was told, pointing his rifle out the window. After a second or two, he thrust the muzzle forward and broke out the pane of glass, less because he knew it would make for a better aim than because it was what gunmen always did behind windows in movies. He felt eager and competent as he knelt there. At least, he had a specific job to do. The complexity of action outside might be wholly beyond his understanding, but nobody could say he wasn't doing his part, nor could anyone say he hadn't done better than Walker and the others, whether he'd fallen asleep on the ridge or not. They were still back there, scared shitless. He thought of Walker's terrified face in the yellow dust, and he made it across the field. He was here. The sounds of gunfire were still all around him, interspersed with spells of alarming silence, but nothing happened in the vacant lot. After a while, his pride gave way to an almost petulant feeling that he was missing out on everything. He wished Bernstein would come back and relieve him of this apparently useless assignment. "What the hell are you doing, Prentice?" said Loomis's voice, and Prentice turned to find him standing there in the room with Coverly and Klein. "Bernstein told me to stay here. He said to keep... Well, you better get back to your squad." And by the time he found his own squad again, huddled against a brick wall 3 houses away, the other missing men were in the process of finding it too. Kripke came trotting up first, then Drake and Brownlee, and finally Walker, whose glance at Prentice was more than a little shamefaced. If Walker had caught him in his melodramatic posture that day of their meeting on the Rhine, it seemed to Prentice now that the score was settled. Gardinella wasn't there, though Prentice didn't give much thought to wondering why, and there was something decidedly strange about Mueller's face. Flaming red with a stunned look about the eyes, but Prentice assumed this only meant that Mueller was scared. He wondered if he looked that way himself. "Is everybody here now for a change?" Finn asked. "All right, let's quit goofing off now and stay together." Prentice wanted to say, "Look, Finn, I haven't been goofing off. Bernstein posted me at the window and I had to stay there." But there wasn't time. Motioning for the squad to follow him, Finn ran to the end of the brick wall and out across an open space toward the shelter of another house. It soon became clear that most of the enemy had either surrendered or withdrawn. Once Finn's squad saw a German soldier running away at the far end of a street, and they knelt to fire at him. But he turned a corner and vanished even before Prentice had squeezed off his single wasted round of ammunition. The first shot he'd fired in the war. For the rest of the afternoon, working in twos, they cleared houses. Prentice enjoyed it. He liked to smash open doors and lunge inside in a marauder stance, ready for anything. In one house, he surprised 2 very clean, frightened young civilians of about his own age. One was wearing earphones, and they'd both been seated at a table over a small, complicated-looking radio set. Prentice couldn't tell whether it was a sending set as well as a receiver, but the barest chance of there being artillery spotters seemed to justify what he did next. He tore the earphones from the boy's head, kicked over the table, and brought his butt plate down hard on the fallen radio, smashing it into fragments that skated across the floor while the two boys winced as if in pain. And what if they were only amateur radio hobbyists who'd spent months or years building their equipment? The hell with them. In another house, he went charging into a room full of old men and women, a dozen or more, all stock still in fear as he whipped his rifle down from high port to his hip. One stout woman in the foreground had screamed and cowered away from him, covering her face with her hands. Now she peeped out from between her fingers, let her hands fall, and looked at him with a tearful motherly smile, saying something that plainly meant she had never expected the invading enemy to be a thin, beardless, exhausted-looking boy. And she came forward and put both soft arms around him, pressing her head into his shoulder while, with his free hand, he reached around and patted her back. It was in another house that he broke into a shadowy bedroom and found himself confronted by another rifleman, and it took him a moment to realize he was seeing his own reflection in a dark, full-length mirror. There was no time to spare. Brownlee was yelling, "Come on!" from downstairs, but he moved closer to the mirror and looked himself over, pleased with the picture he made. Maybe it was a boy's face, a face to make a mother weep. But the rest of him was every inch a soldier. "Coming!" he called to Brownlee, and he took a last proud glimpse of himself before he ran from the room. It wasn't until late that night, as he fought off sleep while standing guard against a counterattack that never came, that he learned what had happened during the 5 or 10 minutes of his kneeling at Bernstein's window that afternoon. In that time, on a street that couldn't have been more than 2 houses away from where he knelt, Gardinella had been killed, and Mueller had become a hero. It was from Sam Rand's droning voice that he heard it, while Sam was relating the story to Loomis. 4 of them, Finn, Rand, Mueller, and Gardinella, had been moving down the street when a German rifleman stepped out of hiding less than 5 feet from Gardinella and killed him with a single shot in the back. Mueller had spun around to face the German, given out a yell, and fallen over backwards, bringing his bar up and firing steadily. He had stitched a row of bullets up the belly, chest, and face of the German before Rand and Finn were able to see what was happening. "And then when I turned around," Sam said, "there's old Mueller on his back yelling his head off and still firing. And there's this big-ass Kraut folding up like a goddamn paper doll. I don't think old Mueller knew what he had done before. I don't think old Mueller knew what he'd done until after he'd done it. Finn says, 'Mueller, you're going to keep that bar. You've earned it.'" Prentice didn't know what to feel about Gardinella. That sad, hopefully friendly little man he'd scarcely known, and whose death seemed so much less important to everyone than Underwood's. But what he felt about Mueller was a childish kind of envy or jealousy. I could have done that. That's the kind of thing I could have done, if only I'd had the chance. And it wasn't until the next morning, on the march again, that he learned what had happened to Bernstein's hastily reformed squad during that same brief time. They had run into a machine gun that killed 2 of the new replacements and wounded a third. Bernstein himself had knocked out the gun with a beautifully aimed hand grenade, and his barman had dropped another German who was trying to make a getaway. Both actions already had the unlikely, made-up sound of all second-hand war stories, yet both had taken place right there within a few yards of him. And it seemed to him now, as he walked and tried to adjust the rifle grenade bag to ease the ache in his chest, that his own performance yesterday had been ludicrous. What had he done, after all, except to fall asleep on the ridge to miss out on all the combat? To break a radio? To please an old woman? And even, Jesus, to admire himself in a mirror? There was no coherence to the days and nights that followed. There was never a whole night's sleep, and there was never enough to eat. Mile after mile of what was said to be the roar was slowly consumed in the changeless rhythm of walking on heavy, swollen feet. Through a haze of exhaustion, the broken towns rose up and divided into broken streets and houses, and the houses divided into rooms. Then rooms, houses, streets, and towns closed up and fell behind. And there were more roads, more fields and woods and railroad tracks and factories with other towns waiting. And there was something called the Dortmund Ems Canal, which they had to cross at night. One of the other companies was to make the assault, but a Finn squad was detailed to work for battalion headquarters. Their job was to follow directly behind the assault company carrying reels of communications wire. The reels each weighed 40 or 50 pounds, and the one Prentice drew was missing its handle. It had to be carried by a looped and knotted strand of wire that bit into the flesh of his hand. Carrying his rifle at the balance in his other hand, he allowed himself to think about nothing but Walker's helmet, which moved ahead of him on the road as they approached the canal in almost total darkness. He wanted to turn around and whisper, "Sam," to make sure that Rand was following him, but he was afraid to turn around even for a second. It was like that other march into Ouroboros last winter, except that then at least there had been snow to silhouette the figures around him. The first high, fluttering rush of an 88 sent him sprawling into the roadside ditch with the heavy reel falling against his kidneys. Slam! Walker was lying ahead of him, and by reaching out his left hand with the strand of wire hiked up over his wrist, he could touch the sole of Walker's boot. "Keep moving, men," somebody was calling. Then came another fluttering rush and another explosion. But Walker's boot stayed where it was, and so did Prentice. "Keep moving, men." Slam! And this time Prentice felt something clink on his helmet and spatter across his back. From the other side of the road there was a tremulous, almost apologetic voice. "Medic? Medic? Where are you?" "Over here. Here is..." "Keep moving, men." Walker's boot moved, and Prentice followed it, scrambling up to the road and running, rifle in one hand and reel in the other. At the next fluttering rush, Walker and Prentice hit the ditch in the time slam, and then they got up quickly and ran again. Everyone was running now. Across the road, a new voice had broken into a scream. "Oh, the blood's coming out. It's coming out. It's coming out." "Quiet. Shut the bastard up. It's coming out. It's coming out." Where are you?" "Keep moving, men." Walker's back slipped away in the darkness, seeming to turn right. Then it seemed to turn right again, heading for the rear, but Prentice couldn't be sure. He stood hesitating in the middle of the road, turning around until he saw it moving again straight ahead. But was this the same back? Wasn't it too narrow and too short? There was another fluttering rush, and the back fell, and Prentice fell beside it, grabbing it by the shoulder. "Walker?" he asked after the explosion. "Wrong man, Mac." He was up and running again. "Walker? Walker?" The carrying wire of the reel was a burning crease of pain in his hand. He slowed down to keep in step with the short figure who looked like Sam Rand, but who, to judge from the authoritative way he was saying, "Keep moving, men," was some kind of an officer. With absurd politeness, Prentice said, "Pardon me, sir, can you tell me where the wire detail is?" And at least the officer, too, was rattled enough to be absurdly polite. "I'm afraid not, soldier. Sorry. Keep moving, then." Prentice pulled ahead of him and ran out across the road. At the top of the road's crown, he heard another fluttering rush, and he dove for the other side like a ball player sliding into home, just in time. Slam! A man was lying face down in the ditch beside him. "Hey, Mac, you seen the wire detail?" There was no answer. "Hey, Mac." Still no answer. Maybe the man was dead. Or maybe just scared half to death. Prentice got up and ran again, and it wasn't until much later that he thought, or maybe wounded. Jesus, was I supposed to stop and feel his heart or call a medic? All he did was run, heading back across the road again, only ducking for the shells now, and sometimes not even ducking, feeling brave because he was on his feet and everybody else was falling down. The road ended, and he ran with the crowd down a wide slope of muddy earth. The 88s were falling mostly behind him now, or seemed to be, and now he was riding on some kind of wooden ramp. It seemed to be nothing more than a plank flung part of the way across the water, sloping sharply downward and shuddering with the weight of many jostling runners. "Take it easy, you guys," somebody was saying. "Take it easy." Then there was an ice-cold shock of water up his legs as the plank ended. He was wading thigh-deep. Just ahead of him, a man fell forward with a heavy splash, and two others stopped to help him up. Then abruptly the mud of the opposite shore was rising under his feet. He was on land again, but something high and straight was looming ahead, darker than the sky. It was a retaining wall, stone or concrete, 10 or 15 feet tall. Somebody was saying, "Ladders, ladders," and he groped ahead to find slick wooden rungs against the wall. He slung his rifle and thrust his other arm through the carrying wire of the reel to free both hands, and he began to climb, dimly aware of other ladders and other men climbing on either side of him. The rungs ended short of the top, and there was an instant of frantic teetering without a handhold until a pair of arms reached down to help him up. "Thanks," he said, getting one knee up over the edge, and the man ran off. He turned back to reach down and take hold of the next man's arms, and the next man said, "Thanks." All along the top of the embankment there was a babble of voices, excited and out of breath. "This way. Which way? Where the hell do we go now?" They were in the plowed field. The ridged, uneven earth gave like a sponge beneath their feet. Prentice followed the sounds of voices into the darkness, running again, while the shells rushed overhead to explode well behind him, back on the other side of the canal. And it was there in the field, slightly behind him and to the right, that he heard Sam Rand's voice. "Prentice? That you?" "Sam, Jesus, where the hell have you been? Where have I been? My God, I've been looking all over hell for you. Where's Walker?" "Keep your voice down. They're all on up ahead. I hung back to look for you." "Got your wire?" "Of course I got it. What the hell do you think I'd hang on to it then? And try to keep up this time. Come on." Jogging along in Rand's wake, he felt a bitter sense of injustice. He was angrily determined not to accept whatever reprimand Finn might have for him. "God damn it, I didn't fall behind," he silently rehearsed in his mind. "For all I know, I got across the damn canal before you guys did." The reprimand came half an hour later, just before daybreak, when the wire detail was over and they were crouched along a wall of the village that lay beyond the plowed field, waiting to be dismissed and rejoin their platoon. "Finn wants to see you, Prentice," said Walker in a righteous voice, and Prentice went up to the place where Finn sat against the wall. There was just enough light to see the jaunty angle of his helmet and the thin shape of his angry face. "Prentice," he said, "what happened back there?" "I lost sight of Walker during the shelling, that's all." "Well, why the fuck can't you keep up?" "Keep up?" He knew that a mumbled apology now might save him from worse trouble, but he couldn't stop his voice. "It wasn't a question of keeping up, Finn. My God, I crossed the canal when you did. I may have even crossed it before you did. I mean, look, Finn, if you want to pick on somebody, that's one thing, but don't be telling me I ain't picking on nobody, soldier. All right, don't be telling me I can't keep up, that's all. I got separated, that's all." "Yeah, and you got a big fucking mouth too, don't you? Now you shut up and listen to me." Shamefaced and dry in the mouth, there was nothing for Prentice to do but listen. All the other members of the squad were listening too. "I got no use for fuck-ups, Prentice, and you done a pretty good job of fucking up right along, ain't ya? Ain't ya?" Well, as long as you're in this squad, you're going to soldier with the rest of us. And I don't want to hear any more snotty-ass remarks. Got that straight? Finn, I got that straight? Yes. All right. Get on back now. It could have been 2 or 3 days or 5 days after that. Everyone had lost track of time when they marched all day in the rain. Their objective for the day was to take the high ground beyond still another town. And to get there, after they'd cleared the town, was to walk across acres of bombed-out factories and warehouses, a flatland of industrial ruin. Keep it spread out now, Finn kept calling as the squad picked its way over the loose bricks, the snaking wires, and the tilting, seesawing slabs of concrete. They were once again in the point of the platoon and company formation. Far ahead rose a big, undamaged brick structure surmounted by a derrick, and beside it, extending for what seemed half a mile across the horizon, was a mountainous heap of coal, as black and shining as licorice in the rain. Coming closer, they could see a railroad yard lay along the foot of the coal heap, many parallel tracks and switches and sidings, on one of which stood a train of gondola cars. The big building was evidently a loading station. It straddled the tracks on a forest of brick pillars. Almost any point in this intricate scene, the coal heap or the loading station or any of several smaller buildings around it would make a good enemy gun emplacement or artillery observation post. And so they moved stealthily, carrying their rifles like hunters. The first 88s came in just as the squad was approaching one of the smaller buildings beside the loading station. All they had to do was run the last few yards and scurry inside, and they were safe. But looking back, they saw the panicky disorder of the rest of the company as the shells burst among them. Men were running and falling, getting up and running again. Some were trying to take cover in the rubble, and others were trying to run it out. Bernstein's squad made it into the building. So did Loomis and Coverly and Klein. And so did Captain Yates and part of his headquarters group. Much of the rest of the company was safe in the building next door now. Others had fallen behind a broken wall of 100 feet back, and only a few could be seen lying in the open. It was impossible to tell if they'd been hit or not. Well, shit, Captain Yates said. We sure as hell can't stay here. Let's get on out across the tracks. Finn's squad crept around the side of the building to the open place where the brick pillars supported the loading station, and started out across the wide bed of rails. And they were out in the middle of the tracks, halfway across, when a machine gun, no, it was 50 times louder than a machine gun, sent each man leaping for cover behind one of the pillars. In the huge noise of the automatic fire, a river of yellow tracers came whipping through. And the bullets, Christ, they weren't bullets at all, but shells. The shells were exploding against the pillars and the sides of the buildings with sharp detonations. Pop, pop. Almost like flak. It was flak. It was an anti-aircraft gun firing in flat trajectory. Prentice's pillar was an inch or two wider than his shoulders. If he stood very straight, with his back pressed to the bricks, keeping his elbows in and his rifle butt down beside his right foot in a rigid order arms position, he was safe from the shells that streaked past him on either side. But there was no way of hiding from the whining, invisible fragments of flak, some of which flew with a wunk into the pillar above his head or into the cinders at his feet. From the corner of his eye, he could see Sam Rand equally rigid behind the next pillar, and on the other side was Drake. Captain Yates was standing some 20 feet away, close to the wall whose angle protected him from the line of fire. His eyes were fixed on Prentice as the firing continued, and suddenly his grave, heavy face broke into a delighted smile. "Hey, Prentice," he called into the noise, and Prentice could understand more by reading his lips than hearing him. "Hey, Prentice, parade, rest." and he bent over to slap his thigh at the hilarity of the joke. It probably wasn't more than half a minute before the gun stopped, but it seemed much longer. And it seemed, too, that it had stopped only to tease the men away from the pillars. Prentice didn't know what to do until he saw Sam Rand run for the protection of the building where a gate and the others were. He ran after him with the rest of the squad, and the gun didn't open up again. Drake came last, stumbling and trying to hop on one foot, and Ted the medic went out to help him, half carrying him back. He had caught a piece of flak in his leg. Son of a bitch probably ran out of ammunition, Captain Negate was saying. Now he'll disable his gun and take off like a big-assed bird. Either that or he'll come out with his fucking hands in the air. But Finn's squad couldn't linger there to find out what Negate had planned to do about the gun. They were sent running off to the left, shielded by the train of gondola cars. They were to go as far as the train would allow and try to cross the tracks from there. They made it. And then with a good deal of struggling and sliding, they climbed the coal heap. There was nothing to see on the other side but an empty wet plain stretching away to a horizon of black trees. And the view to the right was blocked by another coal heap built at right angles to this one. There was no way of looking down to where the anti-aircraft fire had come from. When they slid down the far side of the heap in an avalanche of falling coal, Finn waved them off to the left. At the end of the coal heap, they met Bernstein's squad coming around the other side, followed by 2 machine gun teams from weapons platoon. And Bernstein had a message from Sergeant Loomis. Both squads with machine gun support were now to take up a defensive position at this end of the coal heap. Half the group would dig in on top of the heap at points that would command the whole stretch of land before them. The other half would rest in a small brick building to the rear. Halfway through the night, the men in the building would relieve the men on the coal. Okay, only look, Finn, Bernstein said. I've only got 5 men. Can I borrow one of yours? Can I have Prentice here? Sure you can have him, Finn said. And Prentice didn't know whether to feel pride or shame. It was pleasing that Bernstein wanted him. Maybe it meant he remembered the day they had crossed that field together. But it was galling that Finn was so eager to let him go. It was decided that Finn's squad would take the first shift on the coal heap. Prentice managed to walk beside Bernstein on that trip back to the building and to engage him in a pleasant monosyllabic conversation about what a bitch of a day it had been. He was fearful of talking too much, of seeming to court favor, but Bernstein's kindliness was encouraging. If he did everything right tonight, it was just possible that he might be allowed to transfer to Bernstein's squad. The little brick building evidently had something to do with the railroad, though its cold and rubble-cluttered interior was too dark for them to see much of it in detail as they felt around the floor for places to sleep. Someone woke Prentice once to stand guard outside the door, and after that his sleep was so deep and peaceful that it seemed to last for many hours. Then Bernstein's voice said, "Prentice, are you awake?" "Yes." He got to his feet. "Okay, come on over here." And Bernstein led him to an old roll-top desk that was illuminated by 2 candles stuck onto its writing surface. "You got a watch?" "Okay, here's the deal. You're going to be in charge for a while so I can get some sleep. It's now 12:30. At 1:30, you wake up Cornish to relieve the guard outside. Got that?" "Right. And then at 2 o'clock, you wake us all up. That's when we're supposed to go to the coal pile, okay?" "Okay." Prentice sat down in the swivel chair that faced the desk. "And if anybody comes in bitching from the coal pile," Bernstein said, "tell them you got orders to stick to that schedule. We're not relieving anybody till 2 o'clock. "Right." When he was alone, the quiet and the comfort and the candlelight made him drowsy. He considered resting his head on the desk, but decided not to. It was too risky. Instead, he took off his wristwatch and laid it on the desk and studied the second hand as it crept around the dial. In a little while, Bernstein came through the shadows. "Everything all right, Prentice?" he asked. "Everything's fine." Bernstein sat down in another chair near the desk. "Can't seem to get to sleep," he said. "Might as well sit up. You can go on back and sack out again if you want to." "No, I'll stay awake too." And soon they were conversing as comfortably as old friends. "You're not getting along very well in Finn's squad, are you?" Bernstein said. "No, I guess not." "I'm not surprised. Finn's not too bright. I can see how he wouldn't know what to make of someone like you." "How do you mean?" "Well, you are a little out of the ordinary, don't you think? Why do you think I picked you out?" "I thought it was by chance." "Well, it wasn't. I think you and I are essentially two of a kind, Prentice. We're intelligent, but it's not the kind of intelligence the Army knows how to appreciate. If there were any justice in the Army, people with minds like yours and mine would be officers. I've often thought that. For example, take... Suddenly there was a violent gripping and pulling on his arm, which spun him around in the swivel chair. And there was Krupka, soaking wet and black with coal dust, shouting at him. "What the fuck's going on, Prentice? Where the fuck's our relief?" Then Prentice was on his feet too, shouting back, feeling immensely powerful. "Now you just hold your water, Krupka. You'll get your goddamned relief when I say so. I'm under specific orders to." Only then, with sickening slowness, did he begin to separate reality from the dream. Krupka was real. The candles on the desk were real too. So was the fact that his watch read 2:35. And so was the undeniable appearance of Bernstein hurrying forward from the shadows with heavy sleep, saying, "What the hell's the trouble?" And the whole conversation had been false. It had taken place only in Prentice's head, and he knew now that his head, until the very moment of Krupka's grabbing him, had been lying on the desk. For the rest of that night, soaked and freezing on the coal heap, he suffered little spasms of self-loathing that made lumps of coal rattle under his weight. But that was the last and worst of his humiliations. Whatever mistakes he made after that were mercifully hidden from public exposure. If he remained the worst man in the squad, at least he managed to keep from calling attention to himself. And then one memorable morning, not long after the coal heap, the onus passed from him to Walker. They had marched all night again. They had followed no road, but gone over rough country in the dark. Through what Captain Agate grimly told them was enemy territory, "I see one man strike a match, that man's dead." And they had done it in absolute silence, each of them wearing a strip of white bandage tied to his right shoulder tab so that the man behind him could stay in line without calling out. By dawn, they had reached the place on Agate's map that was supposed to be their destination, and most of the 2nd platoon found itself in a warm, clean farmhouse where a woman agreed to heat water for their coffee and more water to wash and shave in. But soon they were out in the fields again with a bright, misty morning as sharp as winter on their scrubbed skin. They were on the outskirts of another town, and they had to approach it across a swamp that led into a number of little hummocks so dense with shrubbery that they couldn't spread out. The squads had to proceed in single file, making crude, wet footpaths between the hills. The bright, dripping fog was so heavy that nobody could see more than a few yards, and any object emerging into view as they walked, a tree, a bush, a shed, had a look of ghostly danger. They were on right, and it was just then, when the shape had established itself as a barn, that the silence was shattered by a burst of machine gun fire on their left. Everyone hit the ground and wriggled for cover, and there were isolated rifle shots from somewhere ahead. Somebody on the left was shouting, "Fire! Fire!" And Prentice guessed he ought to bring his rifle up and use it. But how could he tell where he was shooting? Bernstein's squad was hidden in the fog to the left, and so was the 3rd squad. Was he supposed to fire anyway, at the risk of hitting his own men? Don't shoot. You men, hold your fire, Sam Rand called from close behind him, and that made it all right just to lie there. He looked ahead where the foreshortened shape of Walker's boots and buttocks lay just beyond his face. Then Finn's voice came back. Let's go. My squad, follow me. And Walker's boots sprang into action. He was up in a crouching run, heading in a wide circle to the right, past a thick hedge and around to the shelter of the barn. Prentice followed him. With Sam Rand close behind, they got all the way around the corner of the barn before discovering that there were only the three of them. The rest of the squad had disappeared. What the hell? Ram demanded. Where's Finn? Who was you following, Walker? And Walker's big, breathless face betrayed his guilt. I thought that's what he meant, Sam, and I thought he meant get behind the barn. How come? Well, I mean, Jesus, Sam, I don't know. Shit, now how the hell are we going to find him? They go straight on ahead or to the left or what? They were safe as long as they huddled here behind the barn. But Sam Rand didn't let them huddle for long. First, he sent Prentice through the hedge to go back the way they'd come. But the machine gun opened up again, and a quick splatter of broken plaster of a foot over Prentice's head made it clear that he was the target. He dropped flat and scrambled back through the hedge in what seemed a single frantic motion. And Rand said, All right, we'll try another way is all. He led them around the other corner of the barn, and they were crouched there, wondering whether to risk it into the open, when the noise of fire broke out again. Intermittent bursts from the machine gun answered by rifle and bar fire that seemed to be coming from several directions. And suddenly, all the firing stopped after the shock of a single explosion. A hand grenade. They were shouting, Get the bastard. There he is. Comrade, my ass, get the bastard. Sam Rand was pointing the way into the open now. Not toward where the shouting was, but to a farmhouse that was now plainly in sight and near which they could see the rising standing figures of Finn and the rest of the squad. God damn it, Finn said. Where you been, Prentice? Look, Finn, it wasn't we were over behind the... But Sam Rand came quickly to his rescue. It wasn't his fault, Finn. Walker led us around behind the barn. And Finn switched his narrow gaze to Walker. What the hell did you do that for? Finn, I thought I saw you going... It was a great pleasure for Prentice to watch Walker's abasement, and the pleasure increased during the rest of the day, and the next day, and the next, as Walker seemed to go from bad to worse. Then a few days later there occurred what seemed to be a chance for both Walker and Prentice to redeem themselves. Captain Nagate wanted volunteers for a special patrol. I'm going, Finn announced to his squad. Anybody else? Shit no, said Kripke. Volunteer? When the whole fucking war is practically over? You ought to get your head examined, Finn. No shit. Walker and Prentice were the only two other volunteers. With Finn, they joined 8 or 10 other men at the company command post, and they solemnly listened to their briefing by the captain. All right, he said, squinting around the group, and there were uneasy glances among the men as they began to realize he was drunk. Here's what I want you men to do. I want you to go out through the underpass, turn left, and keep going till you meet the Krauts. We know there's Krauts out there, but we don't know how many, and we don't know how far. You men are going to find out. Who's the ranking non-com? I guess I am, sir, said a huge bearded staff sergeant from the 1st platoon named Kovarsky. All right, Sergeant Kovarsky will be in command. Any questions, Kovarsky? Sir, is this the reconnaissance patrol? Hell no, it's not the reconnaissance patrol. What do you think we're on, maneuvers? This is a combat patrol. When you meet those Krauts, they're going to be shooting at you, and you better gonna be damn sure shooting back. How the hell else are you gonna find out how many they are? Son of a bitch, somebody muttered. Is this ever gonna be a ball buster? But instead it was an abortion. They had gone scarcely 100 yards beyond their underpass when Kovarsky halted them and called them together for a briefing of his own. "I don't know about you guys," he said, "but personally I never would have volunteered for this deal if I'd known a gate was drunk. I think this here is one patrol we can damn well afford to goof off on. Anybody want to argue with that?" Nobody did. Okay then. What we're going to do is we're going to go on up as far as those trees. We'll lay down some fire into the woods, and that's it. Then we take off, whether we get any answering fire or not. I'll make the report, and everybody else keep their mouths shut, okay? They did exactly that, robbing Prentice and Walker of any chance for heroism. And Captain Negate accepted Kovarsky's fraudulent report, looking throughout the brief interview as though what he really needed now was an hour or two to sleep it off. By now the days and nights were so full of rumors that one story had as much chance of truth as the next. Almost anything could be believed. Nothing in the blur and drift of daily events had the power of surprise. One rumor had the northern salient of the Ninth Army on the outskirts of Berlin. Others placed it hundreds of miles further west. There was still neither corroboration nor denial of a story that had been circulating for days, that President Roosevelt was dead. "All right, hold it up here," Sergeant Loomis called one warm afternoon, turning against the shrapnel-pocked wall to address the platoon. They had come through a village that day, and across a great expanse of open country without any sign of enemy troops. But it had now become clear that there were a good many of them dug into the side of a high, steep hill that rose beyond this larger town. It had begun to seem, in fact, that this afternoon might bring about the first hand-to-hand fighting of the campaign. But Prentice was too tired to feel either excitement or fear. And as he looked around at the other dusty, sweat-streaked, black-lipped faces, it appeared that everyone was in the same listless mood. "This is going to be the real thing for a change," Loomis said. "We'll be making contact with the enemy in the forest this time." He was doing his best to instill a sense of emergency, but his own red-rimmed eyes and dust-caked lips showed that he was as tired as anyone else. For once it must have seemed to him, as it did to others, that his words were something out of a movie. "Now, we're going to get plenty of artillery support before we go up there. But they're dug in good and solid, and you can be damn sure the worst part of the job will be up to us. When we hit that hill, it'll be every man for himself. I don't want to see anybody laying back and chickening out and afraid to use their weapons." "All right, that's it. Any questions?" And they continued to make their laborious way up the steep white flag-hung streets of the town, looking ahead to where the hill rose bald and brown in the afternoon sunshine. Nothing seemed real. At the top of the town, they were allowed to rest. The artillery barrage was scheduled to stay in 30 minutes, and in the meantime there was nothing to do but wait. Finn's squad sat in a sullen, exhausted row with their backs against a stucco house, looking down over the streets they'd climbed. And there was no talk among them until Sam Rand produced a sleek Luger pistol that he'd taken from the belt of a German prisoner in the previous village. "Hey," said Walker. "Nice, Sam. Mind if I take a look?" And he leaned forward to reach across the laps of Krupka, Brownlee, and Prentice. Sam leaned forward to hand it over. And it was then, at the instant of the pistols changing hands, that all the world stopped dead. It was an American artillery shell. Half an hour too early and 500 yards too short, and it plowed into the house 6 feet above their heads. Later, some said it had skip-bombed off the sloping street at their feet before hitting the house. Others said it hadn't. At the time, all they knew was the overwhelming shock of it, the scorched eyes and stopped eardrums, and the panic that had them instantly up and spinning, colliding with each other, losing their helmets, leaping away in all directions with a blind and breathless urgency. Prentice ran head-on into Walker, caromed away and made it around the side of the house, only to go slamming into a high chicken wire fence. He spun away from the fence and took off in a sprint down the street after the frantic figure of Krupka, with someone else pounding at his heels. The second shell sent him sprawling on his belly, and he lay wriggling on the pavement as if to burrow down inside it. When he looked up, Krupka was no longer there. 10 yards from where Krupka had been lay a loose heap of green and brown cloth, and only later would he understand that this was all there was left of Krupka. Then the third explosion came, and the fourth. The brief interval of silence that followed was filled with a sobbing falsetto scream that he was now aware of having heard for some seconds. And he raised his head just enough to see who was screaming. It was Lieutenant Coverley, running down the street and waving his arms. Loomis was close behind him, running into a crouch and calling, "Get down, Coverley, get down!" Then there was another explosion, and another. And Prentice hid his face in his arm and embraced the gutter for all he was worth, thinking, "At least we won't have to take the hill now. At least we won't have to take the hill." He lay there, grinding his teeth and hiding his face in his arm as the earth was rocked again and again.